Abandoned by everyone. A man and his dog turn a frozen mountain ruin into a living paradise. The road into the Bitterroot Mountains narrowed until it became nothing more than a frozen ribbon cutting through a world of white. Snow drifted across the hood of the old pickup, whispering against the windshield like a warning. Elias Hartley leaned forward, squinting through the blur of flurries. He had spent a lifetime trying to outrun storms, but this one tracked him with the patience of something ancient. Beside him, Ranger sat upright. The German shepherd's amber eyes didn't blink, didn't flinch. His breath fogged the window, steady and certain, as if he'd already accepted whatever waited for them at the end of this journey. The cabin appeared only when the wind eased for a heartbeat. It clung to the mountainside like a forgotten scar. Roof half-caved, one wall bowed inward. Snow buried everything that might once have been a home. If the world had ever cared for this place, it no longer remembered. Elias parked and stepped out into air sharp enough to cut skin. The silence was heavy, the kind that came after a long argument with yourself. He stared at the ruin and felt the old ache rise in his chest. He had no family to call, no job to return to, no one waiting for him, just a name written in a dead man's will and a cabin beating its last pulse under the snow. Ranger hopped down, nose to the wind. His posture shifted, alert, listening, as if the mountains were speaking in a language only he understood. Elias exhaled. Looks real welcoming out here. Ranger brushed against his leg, nudging him forward, grounding him in a way nothing else had for years. Inside, the air was colder than outside. Elias pushed open the warped door and stepped into darkness. Dust floated like ghosts in the flashlight beam. Broken beams, rotted boards, a mattress that looked like it had surrendered decades ago. The entire place shivered with every gust of wind. Ranger moved first, sniffing corners, checking shadows. A soldier returning to duty. Elias set down his bag. Guess this is home now. But the mountains had other plans. The storm arrived fast. Snow hammered the roof. Wind clawed at the walls. The old cabin groaned, swelling and shrinking in the cold. Elias lay under a thin blanket, Ranger curled beside him, sharing warmth in the dark. That was when it happened. A crack split the night. Ranger shot to his feet, muscles tightening under his coat. He nudged Elias urgently, a sharp push of his nose. Not fear. Warning. The second crack was louder, closer. Elias sat up. What is it, boy? Ranger barked once, deep and unmistakable. Then he ran to the door, growling low. Only then did Elias hear it. A creaking moan from above, a sound like bones giving out. He grabbed his boots but didn't get them on in time. Ranger lunged, teeth catching Elias's jacket, dragging him across the floor just as the roof split open. A massive tree, torn loose by the wind, crashed through the rafters and slammed into the spot where Elias had been lying. The impact shook the entire cabin. Splinters flew. Snow poured inside, hissing as it hit the dying fire. The tree crushed half the floor, sending dust and insulation into the air like smoke from an explosion. Elias stared at the destruction, chest heaving. Ranger stood over him, tail stiff, ears pinned forward, ready for anything that came next. You saved me. Elias whispered it because anything louder felt like it might break him. Ranger didn't move. He simply watched the hole in the roof, every sense awake, guarding the man he had chosen long before. Elias understood he was worth guarding. But then, beneath the howl of the storm, Elias heard something else. A second sound buried under wind and fear, a sound that didn't belong to the weather. Footsteps, slow, heavy, crunching across snow outside the shattered wall. Elias held his breath. Ranger's growl deepened, vibrating through the floorboards. Someone was out there, someone who shouldn't be. The storm raged on, but the truth settled in Elias's bones, colder than the night itself. He wasn't as alone on this mountain as he thought. And whoever had been watching the cabin before he arrived had finally decided to come closer. Morning arrived with a pale, exhausted light bleeding through the torn roof. The storm had not fully passed, but it had loosened its grip on the mountain enough for the world to breathe again. Elias sat on the edge of what remained of the floor, staring at the splintered trunk that had nearly ended him. Ranger stood beside him, tail lowered but posture alert, watching the tree as if it might decide to fall again. Elias rubbed his face. I should have known life wouldn't make this easy. Ranger nudged his arm gently. It was the same gesture he used during the mandatory therapy sessions at the shelter where Elias first met him. The dog had been trained to anchor soldiers in panic, to bring them back to the present, to remind them that breathing was still possible. For a long minute, it worked. The air smelled of wet wood and cold earth. The cabin felt smaller now, half broken and half claimed by the storm. Elias looked around and felt the weight of something heavier than snow settle on him. This ruin wasn't just a building, it was a mirror. He had been a decent technician once, good at fixing things that refused to work. Air conditioners, industrial freezers, furnace systems that screamed in the winter. He could open a machine, feel the problem through the vibration of the metal, and fix it with a steadiness that had earned him loyalty from customers and grudging respect from co-workers. But everything broke after his father died. His old man had been the only person who believed Elias could be more than a man chasing bill payments. The grief cracked something deep and private. Elias tried to drown it, tried to numb it, tried to drink his way through the empty hours. The bottle didn't fix him. It hollowed him. His wife left first. She packed while he slept off a hangover, taking the photos from the walls and leaving the silence behind. His brothers stopped calling. The company let him go after he failed to show up 3 days in a row. Even the landlord eventually kicked him out. And the day he checked into a recovery shelter, he realized no one looked at him the way Ranger did now. Not with pity. Not with disappointment. With recognition. Elias let out a breath that fogged in the cold. Guess we're both strays, huh? Ranger's ears twitched at the word both, as if he agreed. He lowered himself beside Elias, sitting tall, the way he used to sit beside the soldier he'd been assigned to years ago, the soldier who never came home. Elias had learned that story from the shelter staff. Ranger had dragged the man behind a barrier during an explosion, shielding him with his body even when the rest of the unit pulled back. But the soldier didn't survive the injuries. Ranger stayed by his body until another handler carried him away. The dog had not trusted a single person after that. Until Elias. Outside the broken wall, the forest hummed with the low moan of retreating wind. Snow clung to the branches like white armor. Elias stood, brushing off his jeans. We should check the perimeter. Make sure nothing else is waiting to fall on us. Ranger moved first, slipping through the gap in the wall and onto the snow-covered ground. His paws pressed into the powder with silent precision. Elias followed, pulling his jacket tight around him as the cold bit deep. The clearing around the cabin stretched out like a frozen bowl. Tracks from the night before had already softened under fresh snowfall, but something still felt wrong. Ranger's posture stiffened almost immediately. His nose lifted, his tail froze mid-air. Elias sensed it too. The forest wasn't quiet. It was holding its breath. Ranger walked towards the tree line with a deliberate, cautious stride. Elias felt the shift in the air, the way an animal does moments before a threat reveals itself. What do you see, boy? Ranger didn't bark, didn't growl. He simply stared into the wall of pines, shoulders lifted, body angled slightly in front of Elias as if forming a shield. Then Elias saw it. A shape between the trees. Faint, blurred by distance and the residue of the storm. Human height. Human stillness. But the moment Elias focused, the figure stepped back into the shadows and vanished as if swallowed whole by the forest. Ranger barked once, sharp, commanding, a warning shot into the cold morning. Elias felt a chill crawl up his spine, colder than the snow beneath his boots. Someone had been here last night. Someone had gotten close enough to watch the cabin collapse and chose not to help. Someone who moved with the kind of confidence that meant this mountain was not unfamiliar to them. Ranger paced the tree line, nose skimming the air. Then he froze again, staring at a patch of ground, left untouched by fallen branches. Elias walked over and crouched beside him. Tracks. Not animal. Not his. Boot prints. Fresh. From the night of the storm. And beside them, half buried under snow, was something else. A metal canister, small, oily, the kind used for fuel. Elias picked it up slowly. The smell of gasoline clung to his gloves. It didn't belong here. Not near a cabin that nearly burned years ago, according to the file his uncle left behind. And not on a night when someone stood just close enough to watch. Ranger growled low, chest vibrating. Elias tightened his grip on the canister. Whoever had left this wasn't a hiker or a lost traveler. They weren't running from the storm. They were waiting for it. And suddenly the thought hit Elias with a force stronger than the falling tree. The cabin hadn't been abandoned by accident. Someone had tried to make sure no one returned. Ranger pressed against his leg, urging him back towards the cabin. Elias followed, mind racing, breath sharp in the cold. This mountain wasn't just a refuge for a broken man and a worn-out dog. It was a battleground someone thought they had already won. And Elias Hartley had just stepped back into the fight. The snow had settled into a quiet rhythm, drifting in loose sheets across the clearing as if trying to bury the evidence of the night before. Elias stood outside the broken cabin wall, staring at the boot prints Ranger had uncovered. They already blurred at the edges, softened by the morning snowfall, but they were still there, still undeniable. Ranger circled the clearing again, nose low, tail rigid. Each time he passed the same patch of ground behind the cabin, he slowed. Elias watched him carefully. Ranger didn't move without purpose. Every hesitation meant something. "You smell something else?" Elias whispered. Ranger stopped at a mound of snow, pressed against an old log, pawed once, then twice. The snow crumbled, revealing a dark opening beneath. A draught of cold, stale air rose from it, carrying the scent of rust and old wood. A hidden entrance. Elias crouched beside Ranger and swept away more snow with his hands until the entrance widened enough to see. A narrow, slanted passage disappeared beneath the ground, framed by rotting boards. Not a natural hole, a man-made tunnel, one that had been intentionally covered. Ranger stepped forward, sniffing the edges, then looked back at Elias as if asking permission. "All right, let's see where this goes." They moved cautiously. Elias slipped into the passage first, hunched to avoid hitting the low ceiling. Ranger followed close behind, nails clicking softly against the wooden planks. The tunnel wasn't long. After about 20 feet, it widened into a small underground space reinforced with timber beams blackened by age. It was a storage cellar, and someone had used it recently. Elias swept his flashlight across the room. Dust floated in the beam. Shelves lined the walls, some broken, others tilting under, the weight of forgotten tools. At the far end stood a storage cabinet left ajar. Ranger approached it slowly, nose twitching with tension. Inside were pieces of a life that should have ended years ago. A stack of old photographs, a leather-bound journal, edges curled from moisture, rolled maps held shut with dried twine. And beside them, in a metal box, a freshly stamped pair of work gloves. Elias lifted the photos first. Most were faded, but the faces were unmistakable. His Uncle Robert, younger, smiling the rare smile Elias remembered. Robert posing beside the same cabin, except back then it was whole, strong, alive. In one photo, Robert stood with a stranger. Tall, broad-shouldered, face turned slightly away from the camera as if hiding something. Ranger let out a low rumble. Yeah, I don't like it either. Next, Elias unrolled the maps. They weren't hiking maps. They were geological surveys, marked with color-coded symbols and hand-drawn notes, mineral patterns, soil layers, water veins deep under the mountain. His uncle had been studying the land, documenting it meticulously. But why? Then Elias saw a mark circled in red ink. A point less than half a mile from the cabin. A warm spring. Ranger nudged Elias suddenly, pushing his shoulder with urgency. Elias looked down to see the dog staring past him, toward the steps leading back up to the surface. His posture was rigid, listening. You hear something? Ranger growled, barely audible but unmistakably serious. Elias killed the flashlight. Darkness swallowed them instantly. Above them, faint but real, snow crunched. Slow, deliberate, someone walking over the tunnel entrance. Elias held his breath, hand resting on Ranger's back. Ranger stayed absolutely still, every muscle locked. Through the silence, the footsteps paused, then moved again, circling, as if the person above knew someone was below but couldn't pinpoint the opening. Elias waited, heart pounding too loudly. Ranger's breath was steady but tight against his ribs. Finally, the footsteps drifted away, fading into the wind. Elias didn't move until Ranger relaxed slightly. When they finally climbed out into the open air, the sky had darkened again, heavy with a new wave of snow. Visibility dipped. The tree line blurred into a smudge of white and dark. But something else caught Elias's eye. Near the cabin, half covered by snow, were fresh footprints leading towards the forest. Not the same size as the ones from earlier. These were larger, deeper, someone heavier, someone closer than the night before. And on the porch post of the cabin, sticking out just enough to be noticed, was a strip of torn fabric. Elias pulled it free. It was from a heavy work jacket, the kind loggers wore. The edges were frayed as if it had been ripped off during a struggle. It didn't belong to him, and it didn't belong to his uncle. Ranger sniffed the fabric and let out a sharper, more hostile growl. His fur rose along his spine. Elias tucked the fabric into his pocket, scanning the tree line. He felt watched, not imagined, not exaggerated. Watched. Someone has been here. Someone still is. The wind picked up, scattering snow across the clearing. Ranger stepped in front of Elias, positioning himself between the man and the forest, body angled defensively. The mountain was no longer just quiet. It was listening, and whatever secret his uncle had kept hidden beneath this land had drawn attention long before Elias arrived. Someone had used that underground cellar. Someone had tried to hide it. Someone had been there minutes ago. Elias looked down at Ranger. Looks like we're not just fixing up a cabin. We walked into something we were never meant to find. Ranger's ears turned toward the forest, then back to Elias. He didn't need words to say what the mountain already had. This wasn't an abandoned ruin. It was a warning, and it had only just begun. The storm eased by late afternoon, leaving behind a cold, washed-out sky and a silence that felt heavier than before. Elias sat inside the half-broken cabin, the maps spread out across the floorboards where the fallen tree hadn't destroyed them. Ranger lay close, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes never left the doorway. Every shift of the wind made his ears twitch. Elias traced the red circle on the geological map again. The hand-drawn lines marked more than terrain. They marked intent. The warm spring his uncle had discovered cut directly below the cabin and flowed underground toward the western ridge. The soil data taped beside the map showed something remarkable. The water carried enough geothermal heat to keep nearby land thawed even in winter. With the right setup, it could turn this frozen slope into something living again. Plants, greenhouse vegetables, an actual self-sustaining home. No wonder his uncle had spent years studying the mountain. But the more Elias studied the maps, the more the pieces shifted uneasily in his mind. His uncle never told anyone about this discovery. No official reports, no permits, no record in county files. If the warm spring was real, why keep it hidden? Ranger suddenly stood, head snapping toward the open wall, his nose lifted, nostrils flaring. Elias recognized the look instantly. He smelled something. Elias followed him outside. The snow was softer now, light flakes drifting down like dust shaken from the clouds. Ranger moved quickly across the clearing, tail straight, posture tense. He stopped near the tree line and began to paw at a patch of disturbed snow. Elias knelt. Beneath the thin layer of powder, the ground was churned in a way that didn't match normal foot traffic. Grease-stained dirt, shavings of metal, a discarded bolt, and a faint, unmistakable scent of diesel. Logging equipment. Ranger growled. Not a warning this time, a threat. Elias looked up at the ridge. Through the trees he could see faint tracks carved into the snow, the kind left by heavy machinery. Fresh ones, whoever was, working up here hadn't stopped because of the storm. They were close, and they were confident enough to operate within sight of the cabin. Elias stood slowly. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. They had reason to be here. Maybe the same reason his uncle had kept the warm spring secret. Maybe the reason someone watched from the trees on the night the roof fell in. He followed the tracks for several yards until Ranger blocked his path with his body. Elias frowned. "Come on, boy. We need to see where this leads." Ranger didn't move. He lowered his head and nudged Elias backward, harder this time. Then Elias heard something behind the ridge. A low, mechanical rumble, faint but unmistakable. The hum of an engine. Elias crouched behind a fallen pine, peering up the slope. Through a gap in the trees, he saw them. Two men in heavy jackets stood beside a stripped-down skidder. One smoked a cigarette, blowing the smoke into the cold air. The other checked a small device that emitted a dull beep every few seconds. A signal locator. Not for logging, for identifying mineral-rich zones beneath the soil. Elias's pulse quickened. These men weren't cutting trees. They were surveying the mountain, searching for something valuable underground. The warm spring. Ranger pressed against Elias's leg. His fur bristled from neck to tail. He wanted to move, wanted to confront, wanted to protect. "Not yet," Elias whispered. The man with the cigarette kicked at the snow and muttered something Elias couldn't hear. The other gestured toward the western ridge, then pointed down toward the cabin. Elias couldn't make out their words, but the intention was clear enough. They knew he was here, and they didn't like it. The wind shifted. The diesel fumes rolled across the clearing. Ranger snarled, baring his teeth. Elias grabbed his collar just as the smaller man glanced in their direction. For a heartbeat, Elias thought he'd been spotted, but the man simply zipped his jacket and walked back to the machinery. The two climbed onto the skidder and started it up. The engine roared, echoing through the trees. Elias waited until the sound faded down the ridge before releasing Ranger. The dog bolted forward, tracing the men's scent, but Elias called him back. "Not now. We have to think this through." Back at the cabin, Elias laid out the maps again, but his mind was no longer on the geology. It was on the pattern forming between the lines, his uncle's secret research, the torn fabric, the fuel canister, the hidden tunnel, the stranger watching in the storm, and now, surveyors using equipment worth more than a pickup truck. Someone wanted this mountain. Someone had wanted it long before Elias arrived. Someone believed the land held more than timber. Ranger paced the cabin restlessly, stopping at the broken wall every few seconds to sniff the air. The tension radiated through him. He could sense the invisible threads tightening around them. Elias knelt in front of him. "You don't like the smell of that machinery, do you?" Ranger bared his teeth softly. Elias understood. It wasn't just the smell of diesel or metal. Ranger recognized danger long before humans did. He smelled heat, agitation, intent. He smelled people who didn't belong. Elias leaned back on his heels, staring at the maps. The red circle around the warm spring glared like a warning. His uncle hadn't been studying the mountain for fun. He had been protecting something. And now that Elias had returned, the people who wanted that land weren't hiding in the shadows anymore. He folded the maps, slid them into his coat, and looked at Ranger. "Someone doesn't want us here," Elias whispered. Ranger held his gaze without blinking, as if saying he already knew. Outside, snow began to fall harder again, settling over the ridge, over the hidden tracks, over the secrets buried beneath the mountain. But the message was clear. This place wasn't abandoned. It was being watched, and the fight to claim it had only just begun. The mountain air sharpened by early evening, turning each breath into a thin blade of cold. Elias worked quietly near the broken wall of the cabin, sorting through what tools he had left. Ranger stayed close, pacing the perimeter like a sentry. Every few minutes he paused and stared down the path that wound through the pines, the same direction the men with the skidder had disappeared hours earlier. Elias tried to shake off the unease, but the feeling clung to him like the cold. The maps, the tunnel, the survey equipment, the boot prints. None of it was random. And somewhere in the shifting snow and whispering wind, someone was waiting for him to make a wrong move. Ranger froze, not eased, not alerted, frozen. Elias straightened. "What is it?" The dog's ears locked on the tree line. His tail stiffened. His growl rumbled up from the ground itself. Footsteps crunched beyond the pines. Not one pair, 3. Elias stepped back from the cabin wall as 3 men emerged from the forest. They didn't hide their faces. That meant they weren't afraid of being recognized, or they didn't think Elias would have a chance to tell anyone. The man in front walked with the slow confidence of someone used to getting what he wanted. Broad chest, heavy boots, shaved jaw, dark jacket stained with engine oil. His eyes were the coldest part of the mountain. Mason Pike. Elias knew the name even before the man spoke. Locals in the valley warned newcomers about him. Illegal logger, land thief, man who built quiet threats into a sort of authority. Sheriff's office avoided him. Neighbors feared him. His kind of power was carved in silence. He stopped 10 feet away, hands in his pockets. "Heard you were moving into Old Hartley land," Mason said. "Folks down the mountain think that's a mistake." Elias didn't reply. Ranger positioned himself directly in front of Elias, hackles raised. Mason ignored the dog, but his eyes flicked to him with a predator's calculation. "I'm rebuilding my uncle's cabin," Elias said carefully. "That's all." Mason smiled. It wasn't pleasant. "That's the problem. You're not supposed to." Elias felt the ground tilt slightly. "Suppose you tell me why? Because you weren't invited back up this mountain, and some of us plan to keep it that way." The 2 men behind Mason shifted. One carried a crowbar. The other held a chainsaw not yet running, but ready. The message was unmistakable. Ranger's growl deepened. Elias put a hand on his back, feeling the tension coiled inside him. Mason lifted his chin toward the ruin. That cabin was meant to fall years ago. Seems the storm didn't finish the job. The implication hit Elias hard. The tree that crushed the roof, the fuel canister, the watching figure. It hadn't been nature. It had been them. "You touch this cabin again," Elias said quietly, "and I'll call the sheriff." Mason took one step closer. Sheriff won't climb this mountain for a broken man and a broken dog. The words cut deeper than the cold. Ranger lunged forward with a sudden bark that shook the air. Mason stumbled back a half step before recovering, but the flash of fear was real. Control your mutt. Elias stood firm. He's the only one up here with any control. Mason's expression hardened. Have it your way. But let me be clear, you build one nail in that house, and you'll lose more than lumber. He turned, motioning for the others to follow. As they walked back toward the trees, the man with the chainsaw dragged the blade across the snow, carving a thin line in the ground between the cabin and the forest. A boundary, a promise. When the forest swallowed them, Elias exhaled slowly. Ranger pressed against his leg, still trembling with restrained fury. I know, boy, I know. They're not just loggers. They're after something else. The question was what? Night fell fast, as if the sun wanted no part in what came next. Elias barricaded the broken wall as best he could, then placed the maps and journal inside a metal trunk. Ranger lay by the door, listening to every crack of ice and shift of the wind. But the mountain did not sleep. Near midnight, Ranger jolted awake. His snarl ripped through the cold darkness before Elias even understood what was happening. Then he smelled it. Smoke. Not fire, just the residue of a blown-out match. Someone had been there seconds before. Elias grabbed a flashlight and swung open the door. Ranger bolted out, nose down, tracking. The snow around the cabin looked disturbed, soft footprints circling like wolves testing a weak deer. The shed behind the cabin, one of the only intact structures, stood with the door cracked open. Elias's stomach dropped. Inside, tools were scattered on the floor. The generator he'd hauled up the mountain was gone. The spare lumber he'd saved was split and ruined. His axe was missing. Someone had taken what they wanted and destroyed what they didn't. And on the back wall of the shed, carved with the tip of a knife, was one word: leave. Ranger sniffed the shredded lumber, then jerked his head toward the forest trail. He wanted to chase, wanted to defend the land that had already become his. Not tonight, Elias whispered. Not until we know what we're up against. But as he surveyed the wreckage, another thought tightened in his chest, rough and undeniable. This wasn't just intimidation. This was a warning. His uncle's hidden maps, the warm spring, the secret tunnel, the surveyors, the men with equipment worth thousands, Mason Pike making threats instead of deals. This mountain held something worth fighting over. And Elias realized, with a cold clarity, that his uncle hadn't died protecting a simple piece of land. He had died protecting a secret. Now that secret was Elias's burden, and someone was prepared to make sure he never lived long enough to uncover it. The storm arrived without warning, roaring down the Bitterroot Range like an animal with its teeth bared. Snow whipped sideways, rattling loose boards on the cabin and turning the world into a white wall. Elias secured the shutters the best he could, but the wind shoved the frame like a giant hand trying to tear it apart. Ranger paced the floor, restless, ears pinned back against the howling outside. It was supposed to be a quiet night. Elias had planned only to reinforce the roof and check the warm spring's location once the storm passed. But storms on the mountain had a way of changing everything, and this one felt different. Heavy, dangerous, like it carried intent. A crash echoed from outside. Not wind. Wood splintering. Ranger spun toward the door with a deep, violent growl. Elias grabbed the flashlight and stepped closer. Before he touched the handle, a plume of orange light flared through the cracks in the wall. Fire! He threw open the door. The freezing wind stabbed his face, but the heat from below the ridge was unmistakable. Flames licked up the side of the old woodshed, catching the dry shingles instantly. The fire spread in long, hungry fingers toward the cabin's foundation. And standing in front of it, barely visible through the storm, was Mason Pike. He held a metal can in one hand, a lighter in the other. Two of his men flanked him, shielding their faces from the storm with their jackets. Elias felt his blood spike. Mason wasn't just trying to scare him away this time. He was trying to erase him. Mason shouted over the wind, "I told you this place wasn't yours to rebuild." Elias stepped out into the snow, Ranger pressed against his leg like a living shield. "You're burning evidence. What are you hiding that's worth killing for?" Mason didn't flinch. "That's none of your business. Should have stayed off this mountain." He flicked the lighter again, tossing it onto a trail of gasoline leading directly toward the cabin's side wall. The flame hissed to life. Ranger shot forward before Elias could react. The shepherd slammed into Mason's leg, knocking him off balance. Mason hit the snow hard, cursing as the lighter skittered away. One of the men lunged toward Ranger, but the dog dodged him with a lightning pivot, teeth bared. He didn't bite, not yet, but the threat in his stance stopped the man cold. Elias stomped the gasoline trail, burying the flame under thick snow before it reached the wall. Mason scrambled up, fury twisting his face. "Call off your dog." "He's not attacking," Elias yelled back. "He's protecting." Mason drew a crowbar from his belt. "Protect him from this." He swung for Elias's head. Elias barely ducked. The metal sliced through the air and hit the doorframe behind him with a sharp crack. Ranger lunged again, ramming Mason's elbow. The crowbar dropped into the snow. Mason staggered back, clutching his arm. His eyes flared with something darker than rage. Fear. As the wind screamed around them, something clicked inside Elias. Mason hadn't expected a fight. He expected surrender. He expected to walk away without consequence, like he had for years. And that was the part that didn't make sense. Why burn down a ruined cabin? Why destroy tools, threaten a stranger, and risk being seen? Unless the cabin itself held something incriminating. The truth hit Elias like a punch to the stomach. His uncle hadn't simply lived here. He had known what Mason was doing. He had gathered evidence. And Mason had found out. Mason stepped forward again, shouting through the storm. That old man stuck his nose where it didn't belong. Elias froze. Ranger did too. Mason's jaw tightened. Should have kept to himself. Would have lived longer. The snow, the fire, the broken cabin, everything narrowed into a single point. His uncle hadn't died from the mountain's harsh winters, like everyone had assumed. He had been silenced. And Elias had walked right back into the same trap. Ranger moved first. The shepherd lunged at Mason with such force that both men behind him flinched and retreated. Mason stumbled backward in the snow, slipping on the icy ground. Ranger didn't attack. He pinned Mason with his forepaws and unleashed a bark that boomed through the storm. It was not a warning. It was judgment. Elias pulled Ranger back before the situation tipped too far. Enough, boy. But Mason wasn't finished. He shoved himself to his feet, trembling with adrenaline and humiliation. "You don't know what's happening up here?" Mason spat. "You think this is about a cabin? Your uncle found something he wasn't supposed to, something under this mountain that doesn't belong to your family." "What is it?" Elias shouted. "Ask your dog." Mason jerked his chin at Ranger. "He smells it, doesn't he? The heat under the ground. The old mine shaft your uncle mapped. He knew we were close. Mine shaft. The words felt wrong. Too simple. Too convenient. Then Elias remembered the pages in the journal marked with coded symbols. He had assumed they were geological notes. What if they were evidence of illegal mining? Environmental damage? Dangerous chemicals near the warm spring? Ranger barked again, more frantic now. He circled Elias, nudging him backward toward the cabin. Elias realized what he was trying to warn him of just seconds before the explosion. Not fire, not sabotage. Something deeper. A low rumble rose from the ground. The snow beneath their feet trembled. Elias had felt this once before during his uncle's funeral, when the mountains shifted with early thaw. This wasn't Thor. This was a detonation. Mason cursed and ran. His men bolted after him. Elias grabbed Ranger by the collar and sprinted toward the cabin as a deafening crack split the night. A section of the slope behind the woodshed collapsed, sending snow and debris cascading down like a broken glacier. A plume of hot steam burst upward, mixing with the storm. Someone had blown the entrance to the old mine shaft. Someone wanted the truth buried forever. Inside the cabin, Elias slammed the door and braced it with a fallen beam. Ranger stood beside him, chest heaving, fur speckled with ash and snow. Elias leaned his head back against the wall, heart pounding. They tried to bury the mine. They tried to bury his uncle. And now they were trying to bury him. Ranger nudged his hand, then pressed his head against Elias's chest in a gesture that grounded him more than words ever could. "We're not done, boy." Elias whispered, "Not even close." Outside, the storm screamed, the mountain shook, and the truth clawed its way closer, waiting for its chance to surface. Elias and Ranger stood their ground. The fight for the mountain had officially begun. Dawn arrived as a faint silver bruise on the horizon, barely visible through the thinning storm. The cabin creaked with every gust, but it was still standing. Elias wasn't sure how long he had slept, or if he had slept at all. Ranger lay curled near the door, ears alert even in rest, the way only a dog trained to save lives could manage. When the wind finally eased, Ranger rose abruptly. He nudged Elias's shoulder, then moved to the door. Not pacing. Not anxious. Determined. "You hear something, boy?" Ranger barked once, sharp. Then he pressed a paw against the lower hinge, the same gesture he used when leading Elias to something important. Elias opened the door. Cold air rushed in, but beneath it came another sound. A distant engine. Slow. Steady. Not Mason. Not his cronies. This one grew louder by the second. A sheriff's SUV crawled up the icy trail, its tires gripping the snow with practiced ease. Elias exhaled in disbelief. "How?" Ranger bounded forward, tail stiff like an arrow. He wasn't greeting a stranger. He was guiding the vehicle. The SUV stopped. Sheriff Dalton stepped out, a barrel-chested man in his 50s with a weathered face and a badge that looked older than the mountain itself. His breath curled into the cold air as he took in the ruined shed, the burned patches of snow, the crater where the slope had collapsed. Elias Hartley. He muttered, "When I got your uncle's emergency signal, I thought it was a tech glitch. Didn't expect to see this." Elias blinked. "My uncle's what?" Dalton nodded toward Ranger. "That dog of yours. He activated a locator beacon from your uncle's old monitoring post down the ridge. Your uncle used it for wildlife and rescue. I didn't think it still worked." Elias stared at Ranger. The shepherd sat tall, chest out, almost proud. Dalton's eyes softened. "Smart dog. Stayed at the trailhead until I followed him up here. Never seen anything like it." The warmth that swelled in Elias's chest was different from gratitude. It was trust. Pure, unquestioned trust. Dalton walked closer, scanning the destruction. This wasn't weather damage. What happened? Elias told him everything. The threats, the fire, the explosion on the ridge, Mason's confession, the old mine shaft, Ranger's role in saving him again and again. Dalton listened in silence. When Elias finished, the sheriff's jaw tightened in a way that meant he'd already made up his mind. "We're bringing Mason in." Dalton radioed for backup. Within an hour, 2 more patrol vehicles arrived. They tracked footprints leading away from the destroyed slope. Ranger assisted, nose low, pace unbroken, guiding the deputies with the precision of a trained tactical dog. They found Mason and his men huddled inside an abandoned logging shed several miles down the trail. They were shivering, bloody, and furious. Mason tried to stand tall, but fear made his movements sloppy. Dalton didn't give him a chance to speak. "Mason Pike, you're under arrest for arson, attempted assault, illegal land exploitation, and obstruction of environmental investigation." Mason spat in the snow. "You got no proof." Ranger stepped forward, barking at the exact moment Dalton retrieved the lighter Mason had dropped, half melted from his jacket pocket. "We got plenty. Mason's men were led away first." Mason glared at Elias, eyes burning with a mix of hatred and something colder. Fear of the truth finally catching him. "This mountain will swallow you whole," he said as they pushed him into the back of the SUV. Elias didn't respond. Ranger growled softly, standing between them one last time, as if sealing the boundary forever. Back at the cabin, Dalton removed his hat, the gesture somehow heavier than an apology. "Elias, your uncle was one of the good ones. He kept records on Mason's activities for years. He sent them to me, but never gave me the coordinates of the mine. He must have trusted you to finish what he started." Elias felt something twist in him, a mix of grief, pride, and a strange sense of belonging he had not felt in years. "My uncle barely talked to me. Why leave it for me?" Dalton looked at Ranger, then at Elias. "Maybe he saw something in you that you didn't see in yourself. Or maybe he knew this mountain doesn't welcome people who don't belong. But you do." The sheriff pulled a small envelope from his coat. "Found this in our archives. Your uncle filed it the year before he passed. Said it should be delivered if anything ever happened on this land." Inside was a faded document, a provisional deed transferring stewardship of a protected forest parcel, 50 acres surrounding the cabin, to the next eligible Hartley descendant. Elias's name was handwritten at the bottom. He swallowed hard. "Sheriff, I don't know what to do with something like this." Dalton gave a small, knowing smile. "Start by surviving the winter. After that, maybe rebuild the way your uncle dreamed." Ranger pressed himself against Elias's leg, warm and steady, as if anchoring him to the earth. Elias looked out at the snow-covered ruin, the broken beams, the half-buried warm spring vent still steaming faintly near the ridge. For the first time, he didn't see devastation. He saw possibility. Dalton returned to his SUV but paused before climbing in. "One more thing. This mountain has been waiting for someone to fight for it. Seems like you and that dog of yours were the right ones to show up." The sheriff drove off, leaving the trail quiet and silver under the rising sun. Elias knelt beside Ranger, placing a hand on the shepherd's neck. "You didn't just save me, you saved everything my uncle tried to protect." Ranger leaned into him, eyes warm, breath slow and steady. The storm had broken. Justice was no longer a distant hope. And for the first time in years, Elias felt the weight on his shoulders lift, replaced by something unfamiliar, but welcome. Freedom. The kind you earn by standing your ground. The kind you share with a dog who refuses to leave your side. Winter surrendered slowly that year, like a tired animal crawling back into the shadows. When spring finally pushed through the frost, Elias stood on the rebuilt porch of the cabin and barely recognized the place he had nearly died in 12 months earlier. The cabin no longer sagged. It breathed. Thick cedar beams reinforced the frame. New windows caught the morning light, glowing amber. Smoke drifted steadily from a stone chimney Elias had rebuilt by hand. The land around it, once scarred by fire and illegal machinery, was now a patchwork of green shoots, young saplings, and careful restoration. Ranger lay stretched across the porch, one paw hanging off the edge, eyes half closed but always aware. His coat looked healthier, thicker. The dog had aged a little, the fur around his muzzle turning frost white, but his presence felt larger than ever. Elias stepped down from the porch, boots sinking into soft spring soil. Morning steam curled from the natural warm spring vent he'd dug open and harnessed. It fed into a system of pipes he and Ranger had spent weeks laying through the ground. Now, warm water flowed through the cabin, giving heat without fuel. The idea had come from his uncle's notes, but the execution, that was his. And Ranger's unwavering company. The mountain had given him a second chance, and he had built everything with his hands. Boards sanded, pipes connected, windows fitted. Every hour shared with Ranger sitting nearby, watching like a quiet foreman. Elias walked around the new greenhouse he had built from reclaimed glass panels. Inside, rows of lettuce, herbs, and early tomatoes grew under the warmth of geothermal heat. Condensation rolled down the panes, misting the plants in a gentle fog. Ranger followed, tail brushing lightly across Elias's leg. The dog paused to sniff the young saplings Elias had planted along the path. Pine, willow, aspen, trees meant to heal the wounds Mason's crew had left behind. A year ago, the ridge was dead. Now, birds returned to the branches with cautious hope. Elias inhaled deeply. The scent of soil and fresh lumber filled his lungs. He didn't know happiness could smell like this. Voices rose in the distance. He turned as two townspeople hiked up the path. One carried a notebook, the other a small bag of tools. Their boots crunched softly against gravel Ranger had spread by dragging small bags one by one, tail wagging proudly each time. "Morning, Mr. Hartley," the older man called. "Got a minute?" Elias waved. "Sure, what's going on?" The younger woman smiled. "We're starting the restoration around Willow Bend. The council said you're the guy to ask about soil rehab and warm water irrigation systems." Elias felt a strange flicker of disbelief, the kind that still surprised him after months of visitors arriving at his doorstep. People coming to him, people trusting him, people asking his advice. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I can help. Let me show you how we routed the geothermal taps." As they walked toward the greenhouse, Ranger trotted beside them, occasionally sniffing their pockets for treats. The old man laughed, offering a dried jerky piece. Ranger accepted politely, sitting before taking it, the way he had been trained. The woman ran a hand over the cedar siding of the cabin. "Hard to believe this was rubble last year." Elias glanced at Ranger. "It wasn't just me." The old man's eyes softened. "Folks in town say you saved more than this cabin, Elias. They say you saved part of the mountain." The words hung in the air longer than Elias expected. He swallowed. "I just did what my uncle wanted, what the land deserved." But deep inside, a part of him finally accepted something he had resisted his whole life. He mattered. When the visitors left, Ranger nudged Elias toward the trail, tail raised. "You want the ridge?" Elias asked. Ranger barked once. They hiked up the slope together. The path was smoother now, cleared of debris. Ranger stopped halfway, ears twitching. He looked back at Elias as if waiting for acknowledgement. "You want me to see something?" Ranger trotted ahead. Elias followed, stepping carefully. The dog led him toward the repaired slope where the miners had detonated the entrance. Snow had melted around the area, revealing something new. A thin stream flowed, out from between two rocks, warm and clear. The mine blast had opened another vent. Natural, pure. Ranger dipped his muzzle into the warm water, then lifted his head, droplets falling from his whiskers. Elias stared at the stream and felt a slow, cold realization. This wasn't just a resource, it was a lifeline, and his uncle had known it all along. He knelt beside Ranger, letting the steam brush his face. "You found this, didn't you? Before I even understood." Ranger leaned into him, pressing their shoulders together. The wind shifted and carried the sound of distant laughter from hikers on the lower trail. People had begun visiting regularly, drawn by rumors of a man and his dog restoring a ruined cabin on a mountain most had abandoned. A miracle spot, they called it, a place that refused to die. Elias stood with Ranger at his side, looking over the valley, where sunlight washed across the forest like a slow-moving tide. New growth dotted the land. Streams sparkled. The cabin roof gleamed. For a moment, the world felt whole. Elias brushed Ranger's head. "You didn't just save my life, boy. You gave me one." Ranger nudged his hand in quiet agreement. A year ago, they had been two lost souls hiding from the world. Now they were the beating heart of a reborn mountain. Elias looked toward the distant horizon, where spring clouds rolled gently like a promise. There was still more to build, more to protect, more to heal. But for the first time, he felt ready. Not just because he had changed, but because he wasn't doing it alone. By late autumn, the mountain had taken on a quiet, golden stillness. Leaves drifted down the slopes like slow-burning embers, and the mornings carried the scent of pine needles and cooling earth. The cabin, once a ruin, stood solid and warm against the changing season. But Elias knew the mountain could become more than a home. It could become a refuge. So he gave it a name. Hartley Ridge Sanctuary. He carved the sign by hand from a fallen cedar log, sanding the letters until they felt smooth beneath his palms. When he mounted it at the start of the trail, Ranger sat beside him, tail brushing lightly through the leaves as if giving his approval. The idea hadn't arrived suddenly. It had grown in small moments. A lost hiker who stayed for coffee, a widow who stopped by to breathe mountain air after months of grief, a former classmate who sat on the porch and cried without saying why. The mountain steadied people. Ranger steadied them even more. It felt wrong to keep that kind of healing to himself. Word spread faster than Elias expected. First 2 visitors, then 4, then a small article in the local newspaper. Within weeks, the sanctuary became a place people sought out when they had nowhere else to go. Veterans, drifters, young people carrying the weight of old wounds, men who couldn't stop shaking when a door slammed, women who hadn't slept through a night in years. Elias welcomed them all. The warm spring fed, shared baths for tired muscles. The greenhouse offered fresh vegetables for simple, grounding meals. There were cabins now, 2 of them, built by volunteers who traded labor for a place to breathe. He watched people arrive hollow and leave with color returning to their faces. But the heart of the sanctuary was Ranger. He moved differently when people came up the trail. His ears lifted, his footsteps slowed. He approached every newcomer with a quiet dignity, sniffing their hands, looking into their eyes as if measuring how much pain they carried. And somehow, he always knew who needed him most. One afternoon, just before the first winter frost, a young man climbed the ridge. He walked unsteadily, his backpack hanging from one shoulder, eyes fixed on the ground. Elias watched from the porch. Ranger stood at his side, but after a moment, the shepherd stepped forward on his own, trotting down the path. The young man froze as Ranger approached. His breath hitched. His gaze flicked wildly around the trees as if expecting ambush. Ranger stopped a few feet away, lowering his head. Not submissive. Inviting. The young man swallowed hard. His voice came out brittle. Is he gonna bite?" Elias shook his head. "Only if you try to steal his breakfast." The young man almost smiled. Almost. Ranger took one slow step forward, then another. When the man didn't retreat, Ranger closed the distance and pressed his head gently against the man's thigh. The young man broke. He knelt in the leaves, shoulders shaking, hands buried in Ranger's thick fur. Ranger stayed still as stone, only flicking his ears when the young man's breath hitched into sobs. Elias walked down the path. "You're safe here. What's your name?" The man wiped his face with a trembling hand. Tyler Graves. Elias nodded. Military? Tyler nodded once. Afghanistan, 3 tours. Elias felt a cold, familiar echo ripple down his spine. He recognized the way Tyler's eyes darted at sounds that weren't threats. He recognized the stiff way Tyler's shoulders locked up when the wind rustled the branches. He recognized the panic he tried to swallow whenever Ranger moved too close. He recognized himself. Tyler stood slowly, still holding on to Ranger. They told me to talk to a therapist. Take pills. Sleep in a room with 4 walls. I tried. I really did, but I can't be in a crowd. I can't hear sirens. I can't even sit in a diner without watching every exit. Elias nodded. I know the feeling. Tyler stared at him. Do you? Do you really? Elias held his gaze. I do. And I know that healing doesn't happen in a doctor's office. It happens when you can breathe again, when you can work with your hands, when you can trust something living to stand beside you. Tyler looked down at Ranger. The shepherd met his stare with calm, unwavering eyes. Ranger nudged Tyler's palm, then turned and trotted up the trail, pausing when Tyler didn't follow. He looked back, a silent command. Come. Tyler let out a shaky breath, then walked after him. Over the next days, Ranger barely left the young man's side. He lay outside Tyler's sleeping cot, followed him into the greenhouse, nudged him away from panic when thunder rolled across the ridge. Tyler began chopping wood with steady rhythm. He helped mend a fence. He even laughed once when Ranger stole his glove and ran across the yard like a triumphant thief. Elias watched the transformation quietly. Ranger didn't just comfort the man. He reintroduced him to the world. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the valley, Elias and Tyler sat on the porch with 2 mugs of hot spring tea. Ranger lay between them, head resting on Tyler's boot. Tyler spoke softly. I thought I was done. I didn't think anything could pull me out of it. But this place, and that dog, I don't know how to explain it. You don't have to, Elias said. Some things don't need words. Tyler stared out at the glowing horizon. Why did you build this sanctuary? Elias looked down at Ranger. Because someone once saved me from myself, and I owed the mountain more than silence. Tyler nodded slowly. Then maybe I can help. Build something. Fix something. Whatever you need. Elias smiled. You just did. Ranger lifted his head, ears perked, as if agreeing. The night settled around them, quiet and healing. In that stillness, Elias understood the full weight of what he had created. The sanctuary wasn't about the cabin, or the warm spring, or the forest his uncle had died protecting. It was about legacy. A legacy shared between a man who had lost everything and a dog who refused to abandon him. A legacy that was beginning to change lives, one broken soul at a time. Ranger shifted, resting his head on Elias's knee. Elias placed his hand on the shepherd's neck, feeling the heartbeat that had guided him through storms, fire, and fear. This mountain wasn't just their home anymore, it was their purpose. The sky over Hartley Ridge carried the soft blue of early winter, that thin, fragile shade that feels like the world holding its breath. The sanctuary buzzed with quiet energy. Volunteers arranged folding chairs beneath the wooden archway Elias had built from salvaged beams. Fresh pine garlands hung along the porch railings. Steam rose from mugs of hot spring cider in people's hands. It was the grand opening of Hartley Ridge Sanctuary, a place born from ruin, a place reborn by the hands of a man and the heart of a German shepherd. Elias stood near the porch steps, the carved sign gleaming above him. Ranger lay at his feet, watching the gathering crowd with calm authority. Even now, he looked less like a pet and more like a guardian carved from the mountain itself. Tyler, now stronger and steadier, moved through the setup line, helping arrange blankets for visitors. Other former guests, men and women who had once staggered up this mountain, hollowed by life, smiled and pitched in. Some chopped firewood, some cooked, some simply sat near Ranger for comfort. Elias took it in slowly. The faces, the laughter, the quiet healing humming through the air like a second heartbeat. After a year of building and recovering, the sanctuary felt complete. Then a reporter stepped forward. He was young, holding a microphone that flashed under the cold light. His cameraman framed the shot with the sign and the rebuilt cabin in the background. "Mr. Hartley," he asked, "why did you keep Ranger with you through everything? Most men would have taken the money the government offered for retired service dogs." The microphone hovered. The crowd quieted. Even the wind seemed to lean closer. Elias looked down at Ranger. The shepherd lifted his head, golden eyes reflecting the snow-bright light, as if understanding the weight of the moment. Elias knelt, resting a hand on Ranger's thick fur. His voice, when it came, was steady. "I didn't keep him," he said softly. "He stayed." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Elias continued, "Ranger didn't save my cabin, he didn't save my land, he saved the man I used to be." Ranger blinked once, slow and calm, leaning into Elias's touch. There was a raw honesty in the words, the kind that didn't need explanation, the kind every broken person understood. A gust of wind swept across the ridge, brushing past them like a familiar hand. Elias glanced toward the tree line, where his uncle's favorite lookout spot had once stood. He felt, just for an instant, the quiet reassurance of a presence he would never see again, but still carried every day. The reporter lowered the microphone slightly. "Would you say Ranger changed your life?" Elias chuckled, shaking his head. "No, he didn't change my life. He gave me one." The cameraman mouthed the words to himself, stunned. Elias stood up and faced the camera fully. The wind tugged at his jacket. Ranger straightened beside him, chest out, ears forward, as if posing for history. Elias's expression softened. "Somewhere down there, someone else is hurting. Someone feels alone. Someone needs what I found up here. And if they're lucky, maybe they have a dog like Ranger to guide them." He paused, eyes locked on the camera. "What's your story with a loyal pet?" The question seemed to echo past the trees, past the ridge, past the line of people gathered around. It was less a question and more an invitation, a reminder that every soul carries its own scars, and sometimes healing shows up on 4 legs with a wagging tail and a heart that refuses to quit. Applause erupted around him. Not loud, not wild, just warm, honest, the kind of clapping that comes from people who understand the truth when they hear it. Ranger pressed closer to Elias, then stepped forward to greet a little girl who reached out timidly. Ranger nudged her hand, and she beamed. Her mother let out a breath that sounded like relief. As people lined up to tour the sanctuary, Tyler approached Elias. "You think your uncle would have liked all this?" Tyler asked quietly. Elias looked toward the mountains. The wind picked up again, gentle this time, rustling the pines in a way that felt almost like a blessing. "Yeah," Elias said. "Yeah, I think he would have loved it." The ceremony slowly dissolved into conversations, laughter, and the crackle of fire pits being lit. Ranger moved through the crowd, greeting visitors like an old friend. Each time he touched someone's hand or brushed against their leg, Elias could see a small piece of fear or loneliness fall away from them. Some dogs wag their tails. Some change the world one person at a time. As the sun began to set beyond the ridge, casting warm gold over the sanctuary, Elias walked forward to stand beside Ranger at the lookout. "We made it, boy." Ranger nudged his hand once, then focused on the valley, calm and watchful. Healing had taken root here, hard-earned, deep, quiet, and it was only the beginning. Elias turned back toward the camera crew, packing up, and spoke one last line, meant not for them, but for anyone watching the story who needed to hear it. If this place or this dog touched you in any way, stick with us, support the work, share the story, and help us keep the heart of Hartley Ridge alive. Ranger barked once, loud and proud, as if sealing the promise. The camera caught it beautifully. A man, a dog, a mountain reborn, and a story that would outlive them both.